The whitish, chalky dust covered everything, turning the soldiers' faces into ghostly masks even before the real action began. This was Champagne, a region the whole world knew as the birthplace of celebration and sparkling wines. But in the autumn of 1915, these rolling hills and plains were preparing to become the stage for one of the grandest and most tragic spectacles in human history. The silence hanging over the positions in the pre-dawn hours was deceptive, thick, like a taut violin string ready to snap. Thousands of men gathered in the trenches peered into the horizon, where the whitish soil, characteristic of this area, treacherously highlighted any figure, any movement. This was a landscape that forgave no mistakes, an open stage where it was impossible to hide. The air smelled of dampness, chalk, and that peculiar metallic tang that always foreshadows a storm, even if the sky remains cloudless. The waiting was not just a pause between events. It became an event in itself. The French command had been preparing this moment for months, accumulating resources on an unprecedented scale. The idea was simple yet grand: to break through the stagnant front, restore maneuver warfare, and end the conflict with one decisive blow. Soldiers in blue greatcoats believed in this. They were told that the enemy was exhausted, that the artillery would do all the work, and the infantry would only have to march through the occupied territory, taking up positions with a rifle on their shoulder. This faith in technology, in the might of industrial power, was almost religious. No one at the time could have imagined that it was here, on these chalky fields, that the old era of romantic attacks would finally pass into history, giving way to the cold mathematics of destruction. The situation that had developed by the autumn of 1915 demanded immediate solutions. The Western Front had turned into a giant wound, crossing Europe from sea to mountains. And this wound was not healing, but merely festering. The strategy that French Commander-in-Chief Joffre called __0_ at the enemy yielded only minimal results at colossal costs. A breakthrough was needed. Allies in the east were suffering setbacks. The Russian army was retreating, abandoning city after city, and diplomatic pressure on Paris and London increased daily. France was expected to perform a miracle, an action that would draw German reserves from the east and ease the situation for the Allies. This was a decision dictated not only by military tactics, but also by high politics, where soldiers' lives became pawns in a complex game of coalitions. Preparations for the operation were carried out on a scale worthy of building the pyramids. Rear services worked to their limits, laying new railway lines, bringing in mountains of shells. The figures appearing in staff reports were astonishing. Millions of units of ammunition, thousands of artillery pieces. It seemed that such a quantity of metal, unleashed on a single point in space, was capable of changing geography itself, leveling hills and filling ravines. The French army, full of determination and patriotic fervor, prepared to demonstrate to the whole world that the spirit of the Gallic rooster was not broken, that the Republic was capable of delivering a crushing blow. However, across the neutral strip, in deep dugouts reinforced with concrete and logs, the enemy was not wasting time. The German war machine, faced with the necessity of fighting a two-front war, quickly adapted to the new realities. If the French relied on élan and attack, the Germans turned defense into a science, into an art of survival. They understood that territory could be held not only by numbers, but also by the skillful use of the landscape. It was in Champagne that the concept of deeply echeloned defense began to form, which would become a nightmare for the attackers. This was not just a line of trenches, but a complex system of traps, hidden firing positions, and bunkers capable of withstanding a direct hit from a heavy shell. When the artillery bombardment began, the world seemed to cease to exist in its usual sense. This was not like a thunderstorm or an earthquake. It was a continuous, monotonous hum that vibrated teeth and burst capillaries in the eyes. French artillery worked for 3 consecutive days. 3 days, during which the sky over the German positions turned into a fiery dome. Observers on the French side reported with delight that the enemy's forward lines were completely destroyed, that wire entanglements were swept away, and dugouts were reduced to dust. It seemed that nothing living could have survived in this hell. The chalky soil erupted in fountains, mixing with metal and smoke, creating a surreal landscape resembling the surface of the moon. This wall of fire had a dual purpose: the physical destruction of fortifications and the psychological suppression of the enemy's will. The calculation was that even if anyone survived, they would be so shell-shocked and demoralized that they would be unable to offer resistance. French gunners, sweating profusely, sent shell after shell, believing that every shot brought victory closer, saving the lives of their infantry comrades who would soon be going on the attack. It was a symphony of destruction, involving guns of all calibers, from light field guns to heavy howitzers, whose shells left craters the size of a house. But it was precisely here, in the roar of the cannonade, that the foundation of a future tragedy was laid. Quantity does not always translate into quality. Despite the monstrous density of fire, many shells fell where they shouldn't have, or didn't explode at all. Reconnaissance failed to uncover all of the enemy's masked positions. The main mistake lay in underestimating the depth of the German defenses. French generals saw lines of trenches on maps, but they did not see what lay underground and on the reverse slopes of the hills. They did not know that the main German forces had been pulled back beyond the reach of field artillery, awaiting the moment when the fiery barrage would subside. The outer layer of this conflict was obvious: the clash of 2 enormous armies, 2 nations, 2 strategies. France sought to liberate its land. Germany sought to hold what it had conquered at any cost. But beneath this layer lay a much deeper, personal conflict. For the common soldier, sitting in a trench before an attack, geopolitical goals held no meaning. His world shrank to the size of a rifle, a water canteen, and the face of a comrade beside him. Fear wrestled with duty, the instinct for self-preservation with discipline. In those hours before the attack, each man went through an inner hell, reevaluating his life, remembering home, family, trying to find meaning in the madness unfolding around him. Letters sent home in those days are full of a strange calm and fatalism. Soldiers wrote about the weather, about food, about minor everyday inconveniences, avoiding speaking of the main thing, that many of them had only hours to live. Censorship carefully ensured that defeatist sentiments did not leak to the home front, but even between the lines, anxiety could be read. It was a conflict of man with inevitability, an attempt to maintain a human face in the face of the merciless machine of war. Officers, who bore the responsibility of leading men into attack, experienced no less pressure. They knew that their orders would send many to their certain end, and this burden of responsibility was heavier than any equipment. At an even deeper ideological level, the Battle of Champagne became a clash of eras. The 19th century, with its notions of honor, valor, and the decisive role of morale, collided with the 20th century, a century of steel, chemistry, and impersonal destruction. The French doctrine of offensive élan, élan vital, assumed that the will to win was more important than material factors. It was believed that courage and assault could overcome any machine gun fire. This was a beautiful, heroic, but fatally dangerous illusion. On the opposite side stood German rationality, cold calculation, which transformed war into an engineering problem. The clash of these two philosophies, romanticism and pragmatism, gave rise to monstrous consequences. When the artillery finally fell silent and the whistles blew, thousands of men rose from the trenches. This spectacle was both majestic and horrifying. Waves of infantry in blue uniforms rolled across the white chalk field like a tide. In the first minutes, it seemed the plan had worked. The advanced German positions were captured almost without resistance. Trenches were destroyed, defenders either eliminated or taken prisoner. Euphoria gripped the attackers. It seemed victory was near, that a breakthrough had been achieved, and the road deep into occupied territory was open. Cavalry in the rear was already preparing to enter the breach to exploit the success. However, it was a trap, an artfully set, devilishly cunning trap. The Germans had employed elastic defense tactics. They deliberately weakened the first line, allowing the French to occupy the destroyed positions so they would come under fire from the second line of defense. This second line, virtually untouched by the artillery preparation, was located on the reverse slopes of the hills, invisible to observers. It was fortified with concrete, protected by intact rows of barbed wire, and saturated with machine gun nests. As soon as the French chains, having lost formation and exhausted from crossing the shell-cratered field, approached this invisible wall, the trap snapped shut. The silence was shattered by the crackle of machine guns. This was not indiscriminate fire, but methodical crossfire sweeping of the area, pre-sighted by sectors. French soldiers caught in the open faced a wall of lead. The attack instantly bogged down. Those who were not stopped in the first seconds lay in craters, unable to raise their heads. Communication with the artillery was lost, telephone wires cut, and signal flares drowned in smoke. Commanders on the ground could not request support, and headquarters in the rear, receiving belated and distorted reports, continued to believe that the offensive was progressing successfully and sent new waves of reserves into battle. The situation transformed rapidly. From a triumphant march, the operation turned into a chaotic slaughter. Hope gave way to despair. Soldiers, pinned to the ground by fire, saw not a broken enemy, but an impregnable fortress. Barbed wire entanglements, which, according to the artillerymen, should have been destroyed, stood intact, forming insurmountable labyrinths. Attempts to cut passages under fire were tantamount to suicide. At this moment, it was not just a tactical plan that collapsed, but the entire worldview constructed by propaganda and staff theorists. It became clear that bravery was powerless against technology, that flesh could not defeat steel. It was at this moment that the full tragedy of the strategic error became apparent. Instead of halting the futile attacks and consolidating their gains, the command continued to drive men forward. The inertia of thought had taken hold. Generals in distant chateaux could not believe that such powerful preparation had yielded no results. It seemed to them that they just needed to press a little harder, throw one more division into the battle, and the enemy would falter. But the enemy did not falter. German machine gunners, working like automatons, changed barrels, fed belts, and continued to mow down the advancing troops. For many of them, this also became a psychological trauma, to see wave after wave of men marching to certain death and to continue pulling the trigger. The climax of the battle arrived when the rain began. The autumn sky, as if weeping for what was happening, opened up, turning chalk dust into sticky, viscous mud. This mud became the third participant in the battle, an enemy to both sides. It jammed rifle bolts, sucked at boots, and made the movement of artillery impossible. The wounded, left in no man's land, slowly drowned in this white mess. The offensive finally stalled, bogged down in mud and blood. Attempts to resume attacks in the following days were more acts of desperation than meaningful military actions. The scale of the losses was staggering. Tens of thousands of young men, the flower of the nation, lay on the fields of Champagne. Medical services were overwhelmed by the influx of casualties. Field hospitals were overflowing. Doctors worked around the clock without sleep, performing the impossible. But even their efforts were not enough. Endless trains of wounded moved to the rear, and the sight of these maimed people affected the civilian population more profoundly than any newspaper articles. The myth of a quick victory was finally shattered. Society began to realize that war was not about parades and banners, but about mud, suffering, and endless sorrow. Paradoxically, it was in this failure, in this bloody impasse, that the seeds of future military art began to sprout. The Battle of Champagne became a harsh lesson for all participants. The French understood that breaking through fortified lines was impossible without the closest cooperation between infantry and artillery, without new types of weaponry, such as tanks, which would appear later, and aviation. The conclusion was drawn that infantry tactics needed to change. Instead of dense lines, small assault groups armed with grenades and automatic weapons. The Germans, on the other hand, became convinced of the correctness of their concept of elastic defense, which they would refine until the end of the war. The resonance of these events extended far beyond the military sphere. Champagne became a symbol of the senselessness of sacrifices made without strategic results. A fracture occurred in the consciousness of the generation that lived through these battles. They ceased to believe in slogans, becoming more cynical and hardened. The literature and art of the post-war years would be full of echoes of this disillusionment. The lost generation began to form precisely here, in the chalk trenches, under endless rain and artillery bombardments. The lesson of Champagne is relevant even today. It reminds us how dangerous it is to rely on outdated dogmas in a rapidly changing world, and that technological superiority does not guarantee victory if the strategy is flawed. The attention of historians from various countries to this event does not wane. For France, it is a national trauma, its memory etched into monuments and street names. For Germany, it is an example of resilience and tactical skill in defense. English researchers see parallels with their own tragedies on the Somme. Even in Russia and Poland, military theorists meticulously studied the experience of Champagne, trying to understand how to avoid a positional stalemate. This event became a universal textbook on how not to wage war, a textbook written at an incredibly high price. The German side, though it held its positions, also suffered serious losses. Their resources were being depleted, and every such assault, even if successfully repelled, brought them closer to collapse. They were winning battles, but losing the war of attrition. The battle showed that defense requires no less strain than offense. The psychological state of German soldiers, forced to sit for days under hurricane fire awaiting attack, was on the verge of breaking. Many went mad, unable to withstand the tension. It was a war of nerves, where victory went to whoever could endure the unbearable longer. With the onset of winter, active hostilities in Champagne subsided. The front froze almost along the same lines where it had been before the offensive began. The kilometers of conquered territory were not worth the lives sacrificed for them. The white chalk of Champagne, mixed with earth, gradually hid the traces of the battles, but the scars on the land and in the souls of people remained forever. The landscape changed irreversibly. Villages were wiped off the face of the earth. Forests turned into a heap of charred stumps. Nature, like people, became a victim of this war. It is important to note the role of communication, or rather its absence. In an era when radio was still unreliable and cumbersome, troop command in battle was carried out by messengers, pigeons, and telephone lines that were constantly breaking. A general issuing an order for an offensive often operated with data several hours old. He moved pieces on a map, unaware that the regiment he was sending into attack had already ceased to exist as a fighting unit. This disconnect between reality and staff plans became one of the main causes of the tragedy. Commanders lived in an imaginary world where everything went according to plan, while soldiers died in the real world of chaos and confusion. The technological aspect of the battle also deserves attention. It was here that new types of shells were massively used. Chemical weapons began to enter the arsenal of the sides, and aviation took its first steps in fire correction and reconnaissance. Champagne became a proving ground where the instruments of future death were tested. War accelerated technical progress, but directed it into its most destructive channel. Engineers and scientists worked to create more effective ways to eliminate the enemy, and their successes turned into thousands of tragedies on the battlefield. The social consequences of the battle were enormous. In the rear, women and teenagers stood at machines, replacing men who had gone to the front. The structure of society changed. Aristocrats and workers died in the same trenches, which gradually eroded class boundaries, though it did not completely destroy them. Grief came to every home, uniting the nation in common sorrow, but also raising questions to the government. For what? This silent question hung in the air over France, growing louder with each new casualty list. The philosophical meaning of the Battle of Champagne lies in demonstrating the fragility of human life in the face of a system. Man ceased to be a hero of an epic poem and became a statistical unit, a resource expended to achieve abstract goals. This dehumanization of war reached its peak here. Individual heroism lost its meaning if it was negated by one random shell fired 10 kilometers away by an invisible enemy. This realization changed European culture, giving rise to existentialism and modernism, movements that sought to comprehend the absurdity of existence. When we look at the events of 1915 from our time, it is easy for us to judge generals for their mistakes and politicians for their ambitions. But it is important to remember the context of that era. They acted within the framework of the knowledge and ideas they possessed. No one knew how to wage a war of such scale. Everyone learned on the fly, and the price of this learning was human lives. The Battle of Champagne is a monument to human perseverance and human delusion at the same time. Today, the fields of Champagne are again covered with vineyards. Life has taken its course. Nature has healed the wounds of the earth. But if you look closely, you can see irregularities in the terrain, old craters and lines of trenches overgrown with grass. They serve as a silent reminder of what happened here. Tourists who come to taste wine rarely think that the soil beneath their feet is literally soaked in history. And this history is not about the taste of wine, but about the taste of ash and iron. Concluding the story of this battle, we return to the image of that soldier who gazed into the chalky distance before the attack. We do not know his name, nor do we know if he survived. But his gaze, full of anxiety and hope, looks at us across a century. He asks us, "Have you learned this lesson? Have you understood the price of peace?" And as long as we remember Champagne, we have a chance to answer, yes. The history of this battle is not just a listing of maneuvers and losses. It is a mirror into which humanity must look to see its darkest and brightest sides. The cycle closes, returning us to silence. But now it is not the silence of waiting, but the silence of memory, heavy and solemn, like white stone in an old military cemetery. The lessons learned from this carnage formed the basis of modern military doctrine. But even more important are the humanistic lessons. We understood that technological progress without a moral core leads to disaster. We understood that war cannot be a solution to political problems in a world where weapons have become too powerful. These truths seem axiomatic, but they were written in blood on the chalk fields of Champagne, and each new generation must rediscover them for themselves so as not to repeat the mistakes of the past. The traces of that autumn of 1915 will forever remain in Europe's genetic memory. It was a moment of truth, when the old world died and the new was born in agony. And this new world, in which we now live, bears the imprint of those events. We are the heirs of those who survived and those who remained there. Our responsibility is to preserve this memory not as a collection of dry facts, but as a living warning. For as long as we remember, they are alive in our hearts, and their sacrifice was not in vain. The echo of the cannonade has long since faded, but the questions posed by that battle still resonate. Is humanity capable of overcoming its propensity for self-destruction? Can reason triumph over the instinct of aggression? The Battle of Champagne does not provide answers. It merely poses these questions with extreme cruelty and directness. And each of us must find our own answer, looking at old photographs of soldiers in strange helmets, standing knee-deep in white mud, against a landscape that looks so much like the moon, but is part of our beautiful and long-suffering Earth.